Welcome back, everybody. Pascal here from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm joined by Guy Mettan, a Swiss journalist and politician who is currently serving as a member of parliament in Geneva, one of Switzerland's 26 cantons. Monsieur Mettan is also the author of the book Creating Russophobia, From the Great Religious Schism to Anti-Putin Hysteria, which he published already back in 2017. Monsieur Mettan, welcome.
Welcome. So thank you very much to invite me for this exchange. I follow your interviews very regularly, and I am very sensitive and appreciate what you try to do.
Thank you very much. I mean, we're trying to bring a little bit of light into the darkness that is the current UK environment.
Exactly.
And I was very impressed that I found your book you published in 2017 about Russophobia. You know, the moment when people come up with every possible stories about Russia and Putin and so on, and it certainly starts in 2022 after the full scale war that was going on. But you saw it very early, and you saw it in Switzerland. Can you tell me more about Russophobia and the Swiss or the European obsession with this Russia as an enemy?
Yeah, so it came from a personal experience because in my life, when I got married in 33 years ago, we decided with my wife to adopt a young Russian girl. As you know, at that time, Soviet Union had collapsed, and it was terrible economic situation, especially in the orphanage. And we decided to adopt one of these poor child abandoned, let's say, in a Russian orphanage without money, support, and food even. And that's why I became a little bit more sensitive to Russia. I learned to know Russia a little bit more. And since 30 years, I am following what happens in that country. And in 2014, I organized also many exhibitions, cultural exchanges, and also scientific exchanges between Russia and Switzerland in the 90s and in the beginning of this century. And in 2014, I was very surprised by the way, as a journalist, I am journalist since now 45 years. I was very surprised how my colleagues from the media were telling, were speaking, were talking about Russia, a completely distorted way of doing normally normal journalism, let's say objective or impartial and so on. But when they spoke, when they treated some Russian subject, they completely failed to be honest and to be fair, in their reports. And that's why after the Maidan events, the Maidan coup d'etat, let's say like that, I say, but it's not more possible to let that to yes, to let that state of affairs in the media. That's why in 2014 I started the book. It was first published in 2015 in French. The first time it was published in French in 2015, but it had some success at that time, and so I found publisher in United States, Clarity Press, which was interested to publish in English and also in Italy. So now it may be 10 last edition was in South Korea 2 years ago, and we are preparing a Bulgarian edition. So it's because this topic was new, as you mentioned, at the time. And so, because I think, and many readers like you, um, they ask questions, but why to hate so much Russia in the West? I mean, and I think if we are normal people, we should try to understand why it is the case. That was the starting of my reflection about the Russophobia and the history of Russophobia in the West, because I discovered that this, let's say, this hatred is very long, has very deep roots in the history, and can be dated 1,000 years ago with the religious differences between Orthodox and Catholic, when the schism, the schism, appeared in the 11th century between Rome, let's say, and Byzantium and Constantinople, which was at that time the real center of Christendom until the collapse with the Ottomans in the 15th century.
Do you think that the schism, like the religious component, still plays a role today in the way this Russophobia works, or is it the geopolitical situation that plays in more? I mean, Glenn Deason also wrote an important book on Russophobia, and he traces it back to the Anglo-Saxon kind of world and the
Yes.
rivalry between the UK and Russia in the 18th and 19th century. Where do you see its main focus?
Yes, we share the task with Glenn, because he's more on the contemporary, the present times, and more focused, as you say, about Anglo-Saxon. I tried, but we are in contact since many years, and no, the religious, I think the religion is still playing a role. It's playing a role from historical point of view, because uh, it has rooted, let's say, cliches or stereotypes on the bad Russian, on the bad Orthodox, and the good Catholic since 1,000 years now. And you have the propaganda fide congregation in Rome, instituted in the 13th century to fight against the bad Orthodox, with the same cliches as now. The Orthodox, they are the barbarians, they are despotic, they want to conquer us, which is completely the opposite, it's upside down. But it was the themes of the religious propaganda made by the Catholic Church since so long time. And that's why it's so rooted in our spirit now, in our minds. And secondly, it's still effective today. If you look the fight now in Ukraine, that's the frontier, the border between, let's say, the Catholic or the Western, because the Protestantism um, is a kind of follow-up of the Catholicism, But if you look the divide line, the gap between the East, the Western part of Europe and the Eastern part, between the Catholic Protestant part of Europe and the Orthodox, it comes from Finland, Baltic countries, and it cut Ukraine into parts, because the western part, in Lviv, they are Unyats, they are affiliated to the Roman Church, and the eastern part is Orthodox, affiliated to, until recently, to Moscow, to the Orthodoxy. And this line is dividing Europe still nowadays. The main, let's say, the main nationalist, the main jingoist in Ukraine, they come from Lvov, from the Western Unyat, former Unyat part of Ukraine. And that's why it's so pregnant until now, this kind of, even if it is not conscious, even if we are not aware of that, but is still shaping, the actual war in Ukraine.
How do you think does it impact, even a country like Switzerland? I mean, in theory, you would suppose that Switzerland would remember that, the last time we were occupied, because we are very proud of 200 years of constant peace, right? And neutrality. But the last time we were occupied, we weren't occupied by the Russians. We were occupied by the French. Napoleon occupied us for
Yeah,
15 or so years. And then the Russians helped kick the French out.
exactly.
That is pretty much forgotten, isn't it? It's even in Switzerland, like Russophobia is very much en vogue, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it's also, you are completely right. Russian, they came to liberate Switzerland from the French grip, from the Napoleon occupation in at the end of the 18th century with Suvarov, in the Alps, fighting against the French troops. It was in 1799, something like that. And they came again with the Austrian, mainly it was the Austrian troops, but as you know, the main troops who have beaten Napoleon in 1814, 13 in Russia, but 14 and 15 were also the Russian with the help of the Prussians and the Austrian. So they liberate the Switzerland, they help to liberate, and what is more important, at the Vienna Congress, who was the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars, it was the Tsar, the Russian Tsar Alexander I, who helped to create the present, the contemporary Switzerland. Without Tsar, for instance, supporting I am living in Geneva. Geneva was outside the Confederation, separated by a French territory. And with the help of the Tsar, we could create the actual, the present borders of Switzerland. That's the territorium, the actual territory of Switzerland. And secondly, also about neutrality, because it was with the help of the Tsar and his Minister of Foreign Affairs, his ambassador, Capodistria. Capodistria was the main Russian diplomat at the time, that Switzerland could get, let's say, the neutrality, because before Napoleon, Switzerland was surrounded by European powers, mainly France, and but also Austrian Empire, who meddle in the Swiss affairs constantly. And with the status of neutrality and the recognition of this neutrality at the Vienna Congress, it was the end of this foreign meddling, foreign interference inside the Swiss affairs. So it was a condition of our sovereignty and independence.
Absolutely. I mean, this is one of the things that I always find fascinating, that we in Switzerland are completely not aware of that. We keep thinking we did neutrality
Exactly. Yeah.
on our own, but actually it was very important that the Russians supported that idea. The idea came from the Swiss, and it was sold via, what is his name, the Swiss diplomat. He has a beautiful statue in Geneva.
Yes, Pictet Rochemont.
Pictet de Rochemont sold the idea to the Tsar, and the Tsar then brought that into
Exactly.
the negotiations, because the Swiss didn't have anyone there. The Swiss were not invited because
Yes.
small. But the
Yeah.
Tsar was there, and then he convinced the others to do it. And Swiss neutrality, then 210 years, guarded this kind of peace that we have. The Russians also were the Soviets were pivotal for the Austrians to become neutral. They accepted Austrian neutrality as a condition to then withdraw in 1955, and Austria became
Exactly.
neutral.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the Russians have been supporting neutrality for a long time, and even now they demand the neutrality of Ukraine. They don't demand that Ukraine be a part of Russia. They demand that Ukraine is neutral. Why is it that, in your view, that the European side, including the Swiss, never see that Russia is actually, tries to use neutrality as a way to create a balance in the region? Because that's, to me, it seems that's what they're trying to do. And I'm not a fan of Russia. I'm not trying to be pro-Russian. I'm trying just to say, like, look, we have these instances where the Russians tried to use neutrality to create an equilibrium. Worked for Switzerland, worked for Austria, was made impossible for Ukraine. How do you interpret this?
Yeah, but that's the long story, and that's the subject of my book. My view is that the stereotypes developed against, let's say, formerly against the Orthodox Church, and nowadays, since the 18th century, against the Russian Empire. It was transposed. All these cliches have been transposed in terms of politics, because now the religion is less important in terms of ideology, but it was transposed at that time against Russian itself, Russian, let's say, state. Why? Because it started with in France with King Louis the 15th. You know. He married a Polish princess, and at the time, so he was very close to the Polish, let's say, side, and also at the end of the 18th century. Uh, Russian, through Peter the Great and Catherine II, the Tsar, the Empress, became one of the most important European power. And the problem for France, France was still Louis the 14th, Louis the Great, was the dominant European power on the continent. And England was still emerging, but not so prominent, not so important as they became later. So it was hard to recognize for the French king to have a competitor at the East. And this competitor to be a Russian empress, Russian state. It's a little bit like America and Russia during the Biden times. It has been hard for America, United States, to recognize they had a competitor. After the Second World War, it was the Soviet, let's say, empire, Soviet bloc. Nowadays, after the collapse of Soviet Union, uh, America was the leading, the hegemonical power in the world. And it's very hard for the American neoconservative to recognize they could have rivals, they could have competitors who are disputing their hegemony. It was the same case for the King of France in the late 18th century. So it was a political competition between empires, the French one and the Russian ones, because Prussia was not so important, England not so important. They became later, and Austria was important, but it was hard for them to have a new rival. That was, in my view, the political roots of Russophobia. So this king, it's just interesting. It's history, but it sounds until nowadays. They forge a fake news, a fake document called the Testament of Peter the Great. They call it Testament of Peter the Great. In that fake testament, it was said that the mission of the Russian Tsars after Peter the Great was to conquer the West, was to be the hegemonical power in Europe. Completely fake. It was written, yes, in the year 1760 around. It has been put in the secret place in the monarchy. But Napoleon, after he became emperor, and after he went in dispute against Alexander the First, the Tilsit meeting in 1807. So they split and they became enemies. And Napoleon was very upset against the Tsar and decided to make the war to Russia in 1812. He published, he found the testament, he published in a book with his minister of propaganda, Mr. Le Sueur. He was the Goebbels of Napoleon, let's say like that. Minister of propaganda of Napoleon, published this fake testament in order to justify for the French public opinion the invasion of Russia. Because he said, oh, look, the historical mission of the Tsar is to conquer us. So let's do a preventive war against Russia in order to prevent the invasion the Russian invasion in France. That was how he explained to his public opinion to justify so big armies, so big expenses to make this expedition against Russia in 2012 and 13. Unfortunately for him, he was beaten, but this fake testament was after the translated into English, because after the Vienna Congress, same as we during this Congress, the two main powers in Europe, as France was destroyed, was beaten, the two dominant powers in Europe were who? The British and the Russian. It was in 1815, it was the main powers in Europe. But for the British, it was they were very pleased with the help of the Tsar, helping them to beat Napoleon. Clear, but just after Napoleon was, let's say, put into St. Helens, the main problem for the British Empire was what? To have a competitor. It was not acceptable for them to share the benefits of the victory against Napoleon with another power called Russia. And that's why they started a kind of pre-Cold War against Russia as soon after, after 1815. They translated this fake testament into English, published, and we have in the British press articles describing Russia as a despotic state, imperialist state, dangerous state, as as we can still read in our media today, same topics, saying, oh, they will to invade, to conquer us, and so. And what happens in 1853? They started the Crimean War. They invaded, they sent troops, British troops, with the French and the Italian in Crimea to make the war against the Russia, against Russian Tsar. So, and you can read, for instance, the Times in 1851, sorry, with some cartoons showing the Tsar, the bad Nicholas I Tsar, with like a vampire, like Dracula, you know, flying on London with big teeth like that to suck the blood of the poor innocent British citizen, it was not the bad Russian at the time. We are not describing as a bad beer, but as a bad Dracula. And there is a book in the United States by a professor of University of, don't remember which university. He wrote a letter to show how Dracula was in fact a propaganda book written in England in the late 19th century, was written as a propaganda tool against the Russian uh, in their competition in Asia to, in the Great Game. So it's fascinating to see how this Russophobia has expanded and is rooted with fake news, fake documents. And just to finish the story, it's a little bit long, I'm sorry.
No, it's
This fake,
fascinating.
yeah, this fake testament was only recognized as a fake in the late 1870s, in 1878, if I remember correctly, by French historians who suddenly discovered that this document was a fake. And why it comes only at that moment? Because France has been beaten by the German in the German French-Russian War in 1870, and France for until 1870 the main enemy for France was Russia, not Germany. But as soon as they went beaten by the German and the Kaiser, German Kaiser in 1870, Napoleon III was washed of the scene, out of the scene. The main enemy for France was no more the Russian, but the Germans. And suddenly, a few years later, historian by magic, discover, oh, it was a fake, this testament, and maybe the Russians were not so bad as we thought a few years ago. And it started to change in France because France was isolated on the continent and scared by German, and they looked for allies. And Austria was a little weak, Austrian Empire. The Italy was not yet, unified, and the British were also competitors on the sea. So difficult situation for France. And they started to think, oh, but maybe the Russians are not so bad, and maybe we could get them as ally, not more as enemy. And that's why they started to become closer, and they sign alliance with Russia. And after that, because Germany was so going, going, the British same the same reflection and joined the alliance until the First World War. So that's the more Russophobia is linked to the power, or let's say to the importance of Russia. The more Russia is counts, let's say, on the international scene, the more Russophobia is higher.
That's
It's directly linked to the power of Russia. When Russia is weak, when Russia is in chaos, like in the 90s, the last 1990s, after the collapse of Soviet Union, everybody likes Russia. When it is weak, when it is in crisis, no problem. But as soon as Russia recovers, the Russophobia goes. That's my historical, let's say, observation. Yeah.
it's it's absolutely fascinating. Yeah, you're totally right. In the 1990s, people didn't need to hate on Russia, but in the Cold War, the
Yeah.
Cold War, the dislike, the distaste of anything Soviet was not just ideological. It had very much to do with everything that part of the East represented. It is fascinating that you can trace it also, that you can link it to the way France approached it, because it's often thought of as having something to do with the UK, which it certainly also has.
Yeah.
But the fact that the French, German, and French British contest also reflects on Russia is often overlooked. But what I wonder is, on the European continent, one Russophobia is very specific, because on the one hand, we have a fear of Germany, but I wouldn't say it's a Germanophobia. I wouldn't say we have a Francophobia, and I don't think we have an Anglophobia, but we do have Russophobia very clearly. Why do you
Mhm.
think that? Why do you think it is that? And maybe let me specify this. When we use the word phobia, literally, phobia actually means fear. But I
Yeah.
often get the impression that this phobia is less a phobia and more a hate. As you said, the Dracula, the show
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
beast,
Hmm.
and showing off like this part of Europe as not part of Europe, and as beasts,
Hmm.
as non-humans. I don't. I remember that there were such pictures about the Germans during Nazi Germany, but very brief. We just don't see it with other nations. Why with the Russians?
Yes. That's why the Russophobia. I use the word Russophobia because it was created by a Russian writer in the 18th century, 19th century. Sorry, Mr. Tutchev, and so it has a historical past. This word, and phobia. Yes, it's fear, but you Russia hate. I don't like also. Yes, because otherwise it's a kind of hate, of racism, let's say, against Russia. but there, in my view, there is no better word to be
Yeah,
used
yeah.
to describe all this phenomenon.
No, no,
But why it's
no problem about the word. I just want to
yeah,
point out that there's something misleading maybe inside the word, but let's leave it there. I mean, it is what
there
everybody uses to refer to this kind of distaste of Russia, but we don't find the same distaste for the others usually, or yeah.
no, but we can say there is kind of xenophobia against the
Yes,
Chinese,
yes, yes.
for the yellow peril, the yellow, you remember all this time. Uh, there is also maybe some, if you go to South America, there is also an Americanophobia, the Yankees against the Yankees. It's also depending of the geographical and geopolitical history of your region. But you are right. The Russophobia is the most developed, let's say, phobia uh, that we could mention. But in my view, yes, it's related to the specific place of the Russia in terms of geography. It's also very disturbing for Europeans, for instance, to be the leaders of the world, let's say in the 19th century, when Europe was dominating the world, with imperialism and all these empires, French, British empires. And to look at the map, and on the map, you are the king of the world, that you have this big country, I mean, on the map, which is dominating half the planet.
Mm.
You understand? It's, I think it's deeply disturbing for, let's say, people who have a pretension to be suprematists, to dominate the world affairs, to see this so big country, you know, waiting on the whole planet, in Europe, in Asia, and even in America, until Alaska was still Russian in North America. And, I think it has nurtured this kind of Russophobia, uh, it's not very satisfying as explanation, but I cannot find, better ones as the religious roots, the geopolitical roots, and also this kind of world representation
Yeah, but
with this very disturbing continent called Russia.
it's no, it's not at all a bad explanation. I mean, at the end of the day, if we look at the real phobias, the real fears, like
Yeah,
arachnophobia, the fear of a spider, you have to search for the fear inside the person who's afraid, not inside the spider, right? The spider's not the
yeah,
problem.
yeah,
The reaction is the problem. So if we look at this inside the Europeans and the European mindset, and also this colonial mindset, actually, of dominating the world but not sharing it with anyone. Um, I just had this discussion, with our fellow Swiss, Nathalie Yamb, who was just
yes,
recently sanctioned by the European Union. And she points out, look, sanctions are actually a colonial tool that people in Africa, because she's half Cameroonian, that people
yeah, yeah.
have experienced for centuries, trying to outlaw people. Do you think that there's a connection? Because the longer I work on this, the more I come to the conclusion that the unresolved colonial mindset of the Europeans is a major part of the entire problem.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Because for the European, let's say, establishment, it's very hard to recognize they have lost the grip on the world.
Mm.
Because until now, they can, until, let's say, the end of the last century, it was completely obvious that the Western world, Occidentally, was dominating the world not only in terms of military, which was a little bit hidden. You had some wars, but in terms of culture, economy, and let's say soft power. The Western soft power was completely dominating. But until, let's say, the beginning of this century, and especially since emerging, the rising of China, for me, the main event of this century is the lost, the completely lost of European soft power. The soft power of Europe and of the West, who was always dominating since 500 years, let's say, since the first colonial conquest, in my totally collapsed during these last 2 decades, these last 15 years. And it's just impossible to recognize that as a factor. But this is the new reality with the rising of multipolarity, the rising of China, which is completely dominating. I was twice in China these last 12 months. For me, China is, I don't know, 10 light years before United States in every domain, not in terms of economy, of culture, of science, of not yet military, but it will come. It will, you know. And I think the Europeans are unable to be aware that they lost this soft power capacity on the rest of the world, and that's why we have let's say strong fight, for instance, in Ukraine. The Europeans, they completely lost the opportunity and their capacity to negotiate in Ukraine. They just are disappearing from the scene. But they are unable to understand that. And that's why they are so bellicose, they are so warmongering. It's the last reaction of a losing partner to try to keep the grip, but that's desperate in my view. And in what I think, that's the Americans. They are now recognizing they have lost this supremacy, and they are also losing not only in terms of military and economy, but also in terms of soft power. And that's why Trump is also so unpopular, because Biden, it was you know, the usual narrative of the neoconservative. Yes, yes, with more war, more aggressivity, we will continue to dominate the world. But in my view, the Trump's administration is the first one now to recognize, oh, we have a problem. We are losing grip. We are losing our position, and we must react. We should, we should do something. So trying to make tariffs to come to to recover the industrial capacity and to rebuild the infrastructure, the military capacity in order to re become a dominant power, because we have we have lost so much potential during this last decade. We should do something. But the Europeans, they are not yet in that spirit. They are still thinking they can go on as usual with their narratives, and that's you can speak and sign and make press conference, and you have still the grip. That's not more no more the case, unfortunately for them.
Do you interpret like the EU sanctions against EU citizens, Swiss citizens, of course Russian citizens too, but you know the
Yeah,
Russians are like explicitly the targets, but now we have
yeah.
other targets. Do you experience? Do you interpret that in the same way? It's kind of a last ditch reaction to the loss of control.
Exactly. And that's right, that's the desperate reaction of a losing side, this kind of thing. And that's, when I spoke about the soft power, one of the main soft power of the West and of Europe mainly was the democracy and the human rights narrative, saying
Yeah.
we are the most democratic region in the world, we are the most human rights oriented countries in the world. And so, and it brought to Europe a lot of credibility, because this narrative, even for me or for you, I know you are born in Switzerland, we are attached to democracy, even to direct democracy, to the rights of the individual and the human rights. I am also attached. But the problem is Europe has betrayed
Yeah.
these values. Is still speaking a lot about human rights and democratic, but in fact, they are losing it. And with the sanctions, okay, as you said, to sanction Russian, it could be understandable, yeah, because they are the so-called enemies. But to sanction European citizens, like the two German journalists and like Jacques Beau or Xavier Moreau, who are just expressing their right to express themselves, which is recognized by all European countries, by the European constitutions and the European Union itself. It's just a so big contradiction, between the words and the written text and what their practice, that, you know, that's for me the collapse of the soft power in the eyes of the rest of the world,
Yeah.
because the Europeans are not aware of that, but all the rest of the world, the South, global South, the Asian countries, the Chinese, they say, but how can we trust the European values if they are betraying them, sanctioning their own
Yeah.
citizen because they apply the right of opinion and free expression, which is written in their constitutions.
The the irony of all of this, because to me history is littered with irony. You find it almost
Yeah,
everywhere, and one of the
yeah,
ironies of the current moment is, of course, that by screaming and yelling that they do this in the defense of democracy and freedom and so on, you actually, and human rights, you hand all of this, you give it away, you throw it away, and actually it's being picked up by everybody else. I mean, one of the interesting facts is nobody at the moment wants to get rid of the United Nations. Nobody says the Human Rights Charter is a bad charter. Nobody. The Chinese want to keep it, the Russians want to keep it,
exactly.
Southeast
Yeah,
Asia, the Africans. Everybody says this is a good idea. We should have this. So thank you, Europe. But
yeah,
what the hell is going on? So the irony is they're giving it, like they're throwing it out, and of course the others will pick it up and will continue working with it. It's just quite sensational to me that it is happening so fast, and maybe we can use the last couple of like 15 minutes or so to talk about this other invention, this neutrality invention, this idea that spaces should remain free of competition and serve as buffers. And Switzerland, having done that for the longest time, it kind of breaks my heart to see how our government is throwing that away, has been throwing it away for the last 10, 15 years. Can you give me a little bit your opinion on where Switzerland and its neutrality stand today?
yeah. But neutrality in Switzerland has always been, let's say, a little bit flexible or a
Of
little
course.
bit, yeah, because it's a principle. Um, but it's also a practice, and the practice didn't every time correspond to the principle. But that's, let's say, human life and traditional political life. So, but neutrality, what is very disturbing for me as a Swiss, that neutrality has been all the time rooted in our, let's say, political and cultural mind in Switzerland. We grow up with neutrality in our way of thinking. Not only because neutrality is often described by the other nations as a weakness, as something not so good, because the courage means to take side for somebody, for a cause, and so on. But in my view, the real neutrality, it's more, let's say, it's more demanding to be really neutral than to take side, because it's so easy to take side for the camp of the good, the good the good against the bad, you know.
Yeah,
That's
although both sides will always claim that they're the good one, right?
yeah. But neutral, if you are really neutral, it demands to think, you know, how to try to be neutral between two camps fighting against themselves. So
And
it
push back
demands
against
some
both.
intellectual reflection, not just take side emotionally for one and no think back again, you know. And for me, that was the for Switzerland. Switzerland maybe sometimes they didn't apply neutrality, but they tried in the history of our country. We tried to do at best, let's say like that. Even we, if we have yeah, not applied correctly. But now with the decision taken in 2022 taking side unilaterally for Ukraine against Russia, which is, by the way, one of the fifth permanent member of the Security Council, it was a direct hit against the neutrality because normally you have neutrality in war. You know, you cannot take side for a warring side or for a warring country. That's clear, and I think everybody agrees about that. But normally you have also to avoid to take side too frankly for a warring partner too. And in that situation in 22, we took side unilaterally without even a starting of reflection. It was made in the 48 hours after February 24. So it's never happened, you know. Not even a debate, a political debate, reflection and so, but it was directly done. That was for me a big hit. And so we lose for Switzerland, it's very more for me. It's a very big hit against the Swiss spirit, let's say. Uh, uh, why? Because we are not more recognized as neutral now, not only by the Russian side, but also by the friends of Russia and by the global South. So half of the world, even two-thirds of the world, are not more considering Switzerland as neutral. And that's a big problem for our, let's say, soft power, because neutrality was a key element of the Swiss soft power, just to mention, to come back to this
It's a good
concept.
point. Yeah.
Why? Because thanks to the neutrality, Switzerland was always able to be a mediation place to offer, as we call it in French, bons office to the warring countries, to the warring, states. We did it in Georgia during the Georgian War in 2008, during Iran and United States. That's why, and we were always able to offer this, let's say, neutral place, neutral platform. International Geneva, where I live, was always recognized by all the world as a neutral place to meet. The last meeting was a Biden Putin summit in 2001. So it's very recent. Now, this soft power capacity of Switzerland totally collapsed. And that's very, disturbing. And that's why it was a so big mistake to do it like it was done in 22 when Switzerland decided to take side. It's not a question to be, as you say, to be anti-Russian, pro-Russian, anti-Ukraine. It's not. That's not the problem. It's how it has been done without any reflection, any explanation, and any recul, any distance, And now to rebuild that, I think it's still possible if we accept the popular initiative supporting a return to the full neutrality, but it's a hard task. And for me, the capacity of Switzerland to offer his mediation, his both office, Switzerland was always more important than its size, small size, because of this capacity to welcome international summits, international negotiation during the Yugoslavian wars, during the Cold War, all the time. I remember I published recently because I found back my badge 40 years ago when there was the first Reagan-Gorbachev summit in Geneva
Mm.
in 1985, just 40 years ago. It was in Geneva because of this, let's say, neutrality and soft power diplomacy, let's say. Now it's finished. Russians has said, "Oh, we don't. For us, Switzerland is no more a neutral country. We have no interest to make meetings in Geneva because why not go? Turkey is more neutral than Switzerland or Saudi Arabia or anyway. So I don't know war or Belarus, which is completely, which is completely crazy
Yeah.
if you look in the history for the Swiss people. So
Yeah, but it shows that the perception of neutrality has little to do with like some proclamations about it by the states. It has everything to do with the actions and the perceptions by the others.
exactly.
That
So
you're
you have to,
perceived as a neutral, that you're perceived, okay, maybe not a friendly friend, but at least not a foe. And Switzerland implementing all of the sanctions and so on very clearly stated, no, 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 no. We want to be
yeah,
part of the countries that oppose
yeah,
this, and then you've chosen your side. I mean, it doesn't matter that our federal council says like, oh no, no, we are implementing military neutrality. I think on a certain level it still plays a role because also the Russians, for instance, Switzerland is still, even now, the official good office or mediating power between Georgia and Russia. They
yeah.
didn't stop that. So not everything has stopped, but,
No, no,
more or
there
less
are still
frozen.
discussion. I follow here in Geneva. We have this diplomatic spot platform.
Mm.
No, and just also to the Russian are patient a little bit, like a little less than the Chinese, but this kind of or you live in Japan, they have patience and this distance with and that's interesting. But no, just to mention, there are still discussion. It's not totally cut. I wish to tell you maybe a small anecdote. Last summer, in July, we received here in Geneva a high-level Russian delegation for the parliamentarian summit, the summit of all the parliaments of the world.
I remember that, yeah. Mm.
Yeah, and for the first time since 4 years, we were able to welcome a Russian delegation with a Russian official plane. And it was due to the discussion between Macron and Putin, and also because normally they cannot fly. A Russian aircraft cannot fly over European Union countries. So, but there was a kind of, let's say, great agreement, and the Italian and French let the Russian plane, coming from Moscow, Turkey, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and back to Sardinia and Corsica to Geneva, and they could arrive. They just closed the eyes, let's say, were able to be there, which was, let's say, a kind of peaceful agreement and not official. But when they were in Geneva after 8 hours of flying, there were no more kerosene in the plane, so the plane should make the full of kerosene,
Refuel, yeah, refuel.
well, refuel. But how to pay? Because they cannot pay because the Russian cards are forbidden. They cannot pay, And all the companies at the Geneva airport, they said, oh, we don't want to make the fool because otherwise we will be sanctioned by the Europeans because it's forbidden to make the fool of the plane
to
with
refuel.
our gas. And we don't take the risk to be sanctioned because we had an official Russian plane. So, and it was the Swiss military who brought some kerosene from a Swiss military base to refuel the Russian plane in Geneva. And what happened? And the Russian they paid the full in rubles at the Swiss embassy in Moscow because we are Swiss. Everything should be paid correctly. But
okay, there's a little bit of pragmatism left, huh? Because
yes,
this is one of the pragmatic solutions.
it's just to finish on a positive point. So the Swiss were clever enough to let do that, to furnish the services to the Russian, and it looks that there are some contacts to do it, and that's also maybe, let's say, a sign of optimism. Not everything has been broken, and maybe it could be possible to rebuild some normal links and maybe to recover our neutrality and yes, soft power capacity in terms of diplomatic place. Yeah.
I very much like this, and I would like to end on this positive note. I mean, I agree with you. What we need is peace in Europe, peace among our nations, and we need pragmatic solutions for the problems that we have created ourselves. And I include the Russians with that as well, because we are an 8 billion planet and we are self-organizing and we are not good at organizing, but maybe pragmatic solutions. Guy Mettan, Mettan, sorry. Where should people go who would like to follow you? Is there a place where you regularly publish in French or in...
Yes, thank you. I publish regularly, but in French, as French is my mother language. I publish every week or every 2 weeks an article mainly on my Facebook page, Guy Mettan, or on LinkedIn and on websites, a site in Italy called pluralia.com, which is quite good in terms of pluralism of opinion. And yes, some Arrêt sur Info is also a good French website publishing a lot of articles, very, very diverse, with very good. This kind of thing, because after 45 years of journalism, I am, let's say, more or less banned by the official media, by my former employers. So that's the life. But on the internet, yes, we have capacity to express ourselves, like Jacques Beau. Anyway, I give not so many podcasts because I am a writer, let's say, mainly. But no, that's important to be there and to be present and to express our views. Yeah.
It is true. It is true. And as long as we have the tools, we should use them. I will put the links that you just gave me into the description box of this video below. Guy Mettan, thank you very much for your time today.
Yes, thank you, Pascal, and hope all the best for the end of the year, and Happy New Year, and continue with your podcast, please.
I will, and Happy New Year to you too. Merry Christmas.
Thank you.